Hello, everybody. My name is Stephen Miles, and welcome to the Baker Institute for Public Policy's weekly webinar. And today we have a fat topic on border adjustment mechanisms. We have a panel. I'm going to share everybody, so we'll do a few introductory remarks. Yes, the initial question is, what is a carbon border? There we go. We have a nomenclature issue, which is that a similar term is border carbon adjustments, which use more here in the U.S. and carbon border adjustment mechanisms have very meanings. Different carbon adjustments are consideration in a number of countries, including the United States, the European, and Canada. Proposals are similar to each other in one respect, and that is that each would tax, and you see I heard in quotes, I'm going to come back to it, imports of goods in received content in the production of those goods in the exporting country. Quotes, and I know some of our speakers take issue with it today, and I guess if I was really going to be accurate, I might say revenue raising or regulatory actions. But the Wall Street Journal on June 10 published a front page article on the border tax in Europe and that might be coming. So I figured I could borrow the word and use it here. I'm sure we'll have more discussions over the next hour about exactly what that is. But in any event, the various proposals that are out there in different countries differ significantly as far as the goods to apply, the impact that they would have on meeting climate goals, the extent to which they would adjust the playing field, tilt it, bend it, and which countries would benefit or lose under such a system. And this all leads me to my one other slide, which is that what's driving this. Well, we'll hear from our speakers about this, but obviously on the policy side, the international side, COP26 coming up in Glasgow this autumn, the EU Green Recovery Plan, the US rejoining the Paris Accord, possible Green New Deal again. Customers have clear preferences for cleaner energy and for helping with climate protection. And increasingly, investors and lenders are emphasizing ESG, environmental, social, and governance, in terms of being conditions in some cases for their investing or lending money to very noteworthy groups, the Principles for Responsible Investment, 3,100 signatories, $110 trillion in assets under management, and the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials, 70 financial institutions, about $9 trillion in assets. So this is something that is being driven not just at the policy level, but at the customer level, consumer level, and of course at the investor and lender level. And this leads me to the one slide that I really want to share with you all. And here we have a wonderful photograph of a Tesla, a car that's 100% electric. This is the future. We're going to electrify everything, including automobiles. And you can see it's being charged up, and the full sign there, if you could read it all, says, "Charge up here with homegrown North Dakota energy powered by coal." And this, I borrowed this out of EE News, but this sort of begs the question for all of us, I think, which is, the best of intentions in policy will change incentives, and incentives will change behavior. And do we fully understand all the ways in which it's going to be change that behavior? And is it ultimately really going to be beneficial? And that's part of the underlying current of what we'll be talking about today with our four fantastic speakers: Catrina Rorke, Vice President, Policy for Climate Leadership Council; Michael Melling, and I'll introduce each speaker in turn: Aaron Cosby and James Rove. So first of all, thank you to all of our speakers. And let me start with Catrina. And Catrina is Vice President of Policy for the Climate Leadership Council. She's here in Washington, D.C. as we speak. The CLC is one of the key advocates for the carbon dividend plan in the United States that was proposed by several leading former officials of the United States government, including Secretary of State James A. Baker III. She has been a leader in developing strategy and building coalitions for energy and environmental policies based on free market principles. She has managed policy agendas in these areas on Capitol Hill, specifically for the House Committee on Science and Technology. She has a master's degree from Columbia University. I don't usually mention everybody's institutions, but since one of my daughters is getting her master's degree there, I just had to bring it up. And lastly, she gave me permission to note that she has been working in this area since the entire literature consisted of one footnote to one annex to one WTO document. So she's come a long ways, and the subject has come a long ways. Catrina, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk about this issue. Yes, the literature has come a long way since I started exploring border carbon adjustments, and it's really improved by more conversation and more creative thinking. So thank you for hosting this forum, and I really look forward to talking about how I'm working on it with the Climate Leadership Council. So a little bit of background on my organization, what we work on, where we come from. I'm really happy to work on this carbon dividends plan. We call it the Baker-Schultz carbon dividends plan because of the original authors. But we're developing the policy with all of the logos and names that you see here. So when we figure out what climate policy should look like in the United States, it's not just the Climate Leadership Council, it's all of our founding members who help us figure out what's the right level of ambition, what policy instruments should we use, and how should we design those policy instruments to be implemented. So we work with Fortune 100 companies that represent all sorts of different business interests, all the way from sort of like servers to the oil that you put in a car. And we're getting all of those perspectives into policy, including border adjustments. So this group allows us to have a really unique perspective. Our start came from the right? Secretaries Baker and Schultz were the originators of our plan, but we're really happy to work with individuals across the political spectrum. So you'll note that we have also the feather in our cap of Janet Yellen, currently not active in service since she's busy doing other things over at the Treasury, but she's been really helpful in developing this policy and how we talk about it. So just think of, we're working to be bipartisan, we're representing all interests, and we're getting all of those interests on board to help us figure out what policy instruments we need to deploy. So real quick, we work on what we call the four interconnected pillars of the Baker-Schultz carbon dividends plan. A carbon fee, that carbon fee is going to drive emissions reductions in the US economy, cut them in half by 2035 if this is all we do. If we do other things like fuel economy standards for automobiles, change land use policy, things we usually talk about when we talk about climate policy, perfectly consistent with the Biden administration's NDC of cutting emissions in half by 2030. What do you do with the money from a carbon fee? You can have government figure out how to spend it, or you can have American families figure it out. And so we propose to use a dividend to send the money out to American households on a quarterly basis, equip them to make this transition to lower carbon forms of energy, just create a lot more sort of stakeholders in climate action at the same time. Using a dividend will also benefit, in particular, low and middle income households who use less energy will get more in a carbon dividend than they will spend on the carbon fee. Since we want the carbon fee to drive emissions reductions, we also propose limited regulatory simplification. We're going to be driving decarbonization really rapidly in some sectors like stationary sources like electric power. Let the carbon fee do the work. Let's pause regulations in the interim. And then finally, the subject du jour, border carbon adjustments. Because we work with our founding members in figuring out what a border carbon adjustment should look like, we have really unique perspectives at the council. What should a border carbon adjustment do, and how can you make that possible? And because we have all of these companies on board, all of these individuals and these NGOs, we have the sort of unique responsibility to figure out a border adjustment that we're designing today, right? We're building on the literature, we're building on how people talk about a border carbon adjustment to create a uniquely actionable, politically relevant, sort of climate responsive instrument as part of climate policy. So let me talk a little bit about where our conversation with our founding members has taken us. We want a border carbon adjustment primarily to do 5 things. And this comes from our bipartisan climate policy roadmap, which lays out our policy in greater, maybe excruciating detail. So you can check it out at any time. But we want the policy to do 5 things, the border adjustment to do 5 things. First, we want to maximize US emissions reductions. So if we can have a border carbon adjustment sort of insulates the US economy from real or perceived leakage, we can get buy-in for a higher carbon price that'll yield greater emissions reductions with our policy, a crucial goal. Second, we want to enhance US competitiveness. So we've heard sort of in many corners, case studies that the US economy is a really clean economy. We do things while emitting fewer carbon emissions than many of our competitors. I'll talk to you a little bit more about the literature in that space in a second, but we want to make sure that we're poising the cleanest US companies to be more competitive in a future that's adjusting for carbon at the border. We also want to elevate global climate ambition. So the US isn't going to solve the climate challenge all on its own. Border carbon adjustments offer us a really unique leverage point to enhance global climate ambition alongside US unilateral action, a crucial goal here. And then we want the US to be in the driver's seat for figuring out how we can finally reconcile trade and climate. So we have these multilateral discussions that are happening sort of independently of one another, right? Through the UN, we're working really hard on climate diplomacy, figuring out how to get our emissions down. At the WTO, free and open trade, pursue new relationships there to sort of expand the world, get technology uptake all over the place. Terrific. How can we mash these two together so that trade and climate are happening side by side? We're achieving our trade goals and our climate goals simultaneously. Right now, they're not reconciled. We want the US to figure out how to do that because that'll position US companies best. And then finally, we're not going to solve this problem alone. We need our international partners. We want to comply with our international agreements, including agreements like the WTO, just so that we can make sure that we're having sort of maximum action, maximum leverage, maximum buy-in for a stable climate future. So this is how we're looking at the border carbon adjustment instrument. We think it can do a lot of things and do a lot of things well. It is not a footnote anymore. It is a real actionable policy that we can use to enhance climate ambition all over the place and economic ambition. So let me talk to you a little bit about what we call America's carbon advantage. So I told you we have these sort of threads. The US is a clean economy. We work with the cleanest solar panel manufacturer, for example, in First Solar. They make solar panels with fewer carbon emissions than any of their competitors. And that's an advantage that can't be commoditized, right? So they have to go up against manufacturers that emit a whole lot more carbon. So that's a great case study, right? How do we leverage that advantage in First Solar? But we wanted to look at sort of the global economy and certainly a sort of a broader look economy-wide for the US. And we built a tool to help us study carbon intensity in the United States against our trading partners. And this is the sort of punchline of the tool that we built, which is tracking carbon emissions through the economy across 64 countries and 35 economic sectors. And we're zooming in here on our USMCA trading partners, the BRIC countries, and the European Union. Short way to read this: red boxes, those sectors in those countries emit more carbon emissions than the United States. Blue boxes, fewer carbon emissions. White boxes, about the same. And you'll see that the United States has a tremendous advantage against our trading partners. We can manufacture goods with 20% of the carbon emissions of some sectors against Russia, China, India. We are clean manufacturers of a whole lot of things in the United States, and there is no instrument to turn that carbon efficiency advantage into a competitive trade advantage, which means we're losing the incentive to continue to clean up the economy, to continue to decarbonize, to pull other tools off the shelf, to create a more sort of innovative environment around decarbonization. We're missing that instrument that helps us turn this carbon advantage into a competitive advantage. Okay, so we have this advantage. It's economy-wide across a whole lot of sectors, definitely across a whole lot of countries. But what if we actually implement a border adjustment? Last month, we released a study. It's a case study on the US steel industry. We know we have a carbon advantage in steel. What happens if we implement a border carbon adjustment just see how the supply sort of shakes out. And the results were absolutely tremendous. We found that the United States is the cleanest manufacturer of steel of all of our trading partners. We emit fewer tons of CO2 per ton of steel manufactured than any country that we trade with, full stop. Which means in that environment, if you introduce a carbon fee and a border carbon adjustment, US made steel will have a lower price burden than imported steel. So the border adjustment turns that carbon advantage directly into a competitive advantage. If we have this border carbon adjustment, we'll cut imports of steel in half, increase sales of US manufactured steel about 10%, and boost profitability 35 to 40% for the US steel industry. And that gives real benefits. So this last slide I'll share with you is if we implement a border carbon adjustment under the carbon dividends plan, how will steel shake out? This is new value gains by region in the United States, just by seizing that competitive advantage that we have in the carbon efficiency of steel manufacture. So it's a powerful instrument. We can figure out how to use it for the benefit of the climate and the US economy. Let's do it. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Catrina. That was that is fascinating, and it's great to hear about the advantage that the U.S. may have in steel. I know there'll be a lot of questions about other products as well, and about measuring all this. One has to come up with a common set of technical understandings in terms of making sure that everybody's playing by the same rules. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Michael Melling, and we're thrilled to have Michael join us today. And Michael is Deputy Director of the Center for Energy and Environmental Policy Research at MIT. He previously served as the Executive Director of CEPR, the same organization, and was the founding president of the Ecological Institute of Washington, D.C. He serves on numerous boards, too numerous to even begin to list, but notably serves on the board of the European Roundtable on Climate Change and Sustainable Transition, ERCST, which has been closely examining CBAM proposals for the EU. He's a citizen of both Germany and the United States. Michael spends much of his free time, it's hard to imagine there's much of that, at his revitalizing an antebellum farm in upstate New York, not far from another university near and dear to my heart. Michael?
Right. Thank you, Steve. Yes, indeed, it could be more free time. I certainly wouldn't complain. Thanks so much for having me. I did mention to you, my mother, I think I did mention, was an alumna of Rice, so it's a particular pleasure. But I also see many friends in the list of attendees, so it's good to be here. And I think, as Catrina already impressively showed, it's a timely and important topic. She gave a very encouraging outlook, I think, why we're discussing this. And I'll try to share from that vantage point you mentioned. You know, I spent much of my childhood and early working life in Europe, and I still work very much with Europeans, to shed a little bit of light on what's been happening there and put it in context. I have a few slides, and I think we agreed in about 10 minutes, so I'll try to keep it at a swift pace so that we can move on to the other presentations in time. Now, let me share the screen. All right, and just let me know if there's any issues with the full screen, which okay. Does it look good? Perfect, thank you. All right, so the title, I think not surprisingly, Pricing Carbon at the Border, and it's about Europe's CBAM. Interestingly, because you said the terminology has kind of varied. I mean, Aaron and I and others that have worked on this topic for probably longer than we care for, we're used to the word border carbon adjustment, border, tax adjustment, those kinds of words. And it's Europe a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, that coined this new word that everybody's using now. So it's an interesting exercise in sort of branding that now we're used to this CBAM acronym. I would cover three things. First of all, give a little bit of a history and context. I'll really keep it short, but I think it's important to understand where Europe is coming from, because it's also been quite a change, let's say, of previous policy preferences. It's a bit abrupt and took many by surprise. Then looking at what we know, which is very tentative, but what we do know or think we know about CBAM design, what the EU is going to propose and ultimately adopt. And then also finish on a few hot issues where I see most of the potential acrimony and sort of contentious political debate centering or focusing on and looking a little bit at next steps. So first of all, just sort of this backdrop, the proposal, the discussion really started in the early 2000s. A few think tanks, a UK think tank talking about this, really think, it's something that was discussed in academic research as so often, but had no political traction. The French started pushing it in 2006, 7, again in 2009, and over the years again and again. There's just not much appetite, concern about what it would do to trade relations and WTO negotiations, the whole Uruguay round that had stalled and so on and so forth. We also didn't have the Paris Agreement. There was fear of disrupting that. So there was really muted appetite, especially from some countries like Germany, not to raise this. This all changed in summer of 2019, so exactly 2 years ago, when one of the candidates, and it was sort of a swift nomination, if you like, there was other preferred candidates, Spitzenkandidaten as they call it, to lead the European Commission, so the European executive, came up quickly that they needed a sort of replacement candidate. Ursula von der Leyen, a former German defense minister, became the Spitzenkandidat. And she had this package of a European Green Deal to become her like signature policy agenda, if you like. And the carbon border tax is mentioned there, still called a carbon border tax. And it went through the process, her letters to the cabinet, her commissioners, the various commissioners mentioned it, a communication of the commission mentioned as part of the European Green Deal. And I think it's important, so here just the timeline as well that was mentioned already in December 2019, that this is part of a huge and very ambitious agenda to reshape the European continent. I'm not just saying this like, wow, this is so cool, so exciting. No, this is creating a lot of headaches. It's a huge logistical, regulatory, political process, lots of difficulties, but for industry, it's also extremely scary. A lot of companies, that are thinking, how can we actually, how can we transform fast enough to meet these massive transformative aspirations? And it goes across everything from chemicals and pollutants, agriculture, transportation, et cetera, and of course, climate. And one element of that to enable, as Catrina was saying, to enable this, drastically increased ambition, the carbon border, then still called tax. Things that kind of evolved, the Commission renamed it into mechanism because they knew a tax is particularly difficult. The European Council and the Parliament sort of endorsed the work. So the legislature also expressed its support. Then consultations began in 2 stages. We were involved and participated in that. Aaron and I mentioned some work that he and I have done together on this. And where do we stand now? So in March, the Parliament again issued a resolution. It's a bit more formal, endorsing it. And now in July, in exactly 2 weeks, on July 14th, having been postponed once, we expect this slew of packages on making European climate policy fit for the new target of 55% reduction by 2030, its new NDC, of which the CBAM regulation proposal will be one of those. So I'll quickly mention, and I have a slide at the end, and the links are also here for anybody who's interested to dive really deep. Aaron and I, working at ERCST together with our colleague Andre Marcoux, have written several reports. 2 of the longer ones, each 70, 80 pages, unpacks what this carbon border adjustment contains, how it can be designed. A lot of that is, I think, quite applicable, not just to Europe, but more broadly. And then we also specifically look at sectors in Europe and how they may be affected and how that in turn affects CBAM design. Now, as many of you know, and probably unsurprising with any legislative initiative this big, including 12, 13 different pieces, and that's only in climate. We have the same in all the other sectors as well. Leaks happen, some intentional, some unintentional. And about a month ago, the current state of the draft legislative proposal was leaked to the media, immediately spread, throughout the Brussels Beltway and beyond. There's even a link if you want to find the actual draft documents at the bottom of the slide. And I guess we can say, even though I have to underscore, this is an early, it probably has evolved. There's a lot of political coordination across different parts of the Commission that we're still clearly hadn't happened yet. Of course, after the proposal comes out, it enters the political process with the Council, with the Parliament, with the member states. So a lot will still change, and that's a guarantee, but still it's probably the best guess that we have currently. And I'll run through it quickly. What will this European carbon border adjustment probably look like? It'll be a regulation, meaning it's directly applicable. It's not something where every member state has a slightly different way of doing it. And it's implemented through sort of an emissions trading system counterpart to the European carbon market. but it's notional. It doesn't actually, it's not fully integrated. It will cover all countries except countries with linked emissions trading systems. So that's Switzerland, the EFTA countries and so on, potentially the UK in future, but not other countries like least developed countries. There's no blanket exception for groups of countries. Sectors, this is really important. There's a lot of speculation which sectors would be, which not. Cement, fertilizer, steel, aluminum, electricity, relatively narrow, far upstream. Although when you look in the annex, it is some 20 to 30 different, in this case, CN code, customs nomenclature, subsectors, different sort of slightly up the value chain products out of these sectors, like with steel, hot rolled and flat rolled and so products. Emissions, direct and indirect emissions. So not just the directly released emissions, but also those embedded in electricity, for instance, heat, steam, and so on. Trade flows, only imports, not exports. I'll get back to that. How to determine the embedded emissions. There's two different processes for two different periods. Initially, it'll be a little bit simpler. And in particular for foreign producers, if they cannot produce verified emissions data and declare that, there's a fallback where the commission or the customs authorities actually will use the average EU carbon intensity, which is kind of favorable for foreign countries. After the transition period, however, any foreign producer that does not provide actual emissions data will be treated like the worst 10% of EU performers. That to me seems a little bit hard, but then again, I understand why we can't just assume that everybody's moving at the same speed as the European producers. So, but it'll probably be a red line. Foreign policies, only carbon pricing, explicit carbon pricing, a carbon tax or an emissions trading system will be credited, not performance standards or other policies, at least as it was indicated in this leaked draft. I think that's another potential controversy or difficult issue. The budget, the revenue from this will go to the EU budget. There's nothing that goes back, say, to foreign countries, climate finance, things like that, after covering the costs of operating the whole thing. And there will be a new CBAM authority that administers the whole thing, from authorizing importers, managing the declaration process and scrutinizing them, issuing these certificates and taking them back, and et cetera, also appeals processes and so on. So that's the longest slide. Now I'll be really to sum up. This is what it could look like in terms of a timeline. Transition period, if we get through the political process fast enough, first legislative proposals released, it may be adopted by the institutions with some amendments. Often it goes back to the commission and is revised. Anyway, by 2023, the intention would be to have this transitional period begin, and maybe 3 years later, the full period begin, at which point it may expand from, for instance, sectorally from these 5 sort of goods to additional and perhaps also further downstream. Questions about how it aligns with the Paris Agreement's NDC cycle, global stocktake, all those things. There's a lot to sort out, but this is roughly sort of what the timeline might be. Some hot issues, my last slide. I think the status of free allocation, which is the current leakage protection mechanism, how that will continue, if at all, and how it phases out. Huge questions, because the leak proposal keeps it open. There's been some indication that maybe free allocation will drop by 50%, only 50% free allocation. The CBAM only applies to the delta, and then it declines over, say, 10 years, for instance. But we don't know yet, and it's hugely contentious. European producers are very, very eager to have as much free allocation as possible to remain. How to deal with exports is a big problem. Catrina's proposal in that sense offers much more protection for exported products. So European products in global markets currently would not have any leakage protection under the CBAM. Now, of course, I mentioned already, how do we deal with countries that cannot or have not chosen to implement a carbon price, an explicit carbon price, but have very ambitious other policies? Do we completely ignore that? I think that's kind of hard maybe to get through diplomatically. Let's see. And then, of course, the whole implementation of this MRV process and also, of course, the default assumption or carbon intensity. Those are all things that I think will still bubble up in the political debate, but also in relations with other trade partners. Yeah, with the revenue, this is more, I think, for Europeans of interest, that there's a lot of things that will sort of narrow and dilute the revenue. And in the end, some have even argued that you might be paying on top. Let's see, but that's, I think, less important. I mentioned that there's a couple of sources here. If we make the slides available, obviously people who are interested in going into more detail are welcome to look at these sources. Thank you very much, and I'll share my screen.
Michael, thank you for that tour de force. That was very impressive. A lot of great resources there. We're getting a number on the Q&A. Let's note for everybody, if you submit it in on the Q&A, and One question yes, we will try to get the slide from the speakers and post them to the Baker Institute's Center for Energy Studies website after this event. So thank you again, Michael. Appreciate that. And let's go on to our next speaker. We're fortunate today we have Aaron Crosby joining us. 30 years of experience in trade, particularly and in investment. He has served as an advisor consultant to Canadian multinational boards and task forces, energy and sustainable development, including, just to pick a few, Canadian Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade, the International Development Agency, and as with Michael, the European Roundtable on Climate and Sustainable Transition. So we welcome chat with us a little bit about Canadian and perspectives generally on carbon border adjustment mechanisms.
Thanks very much, Stephen. It's a pleasure to be here. Well, it's not a pleasure to be where I'm sitting right now. I'm coming to you from the center of the heat dome that's sitting over Western Canada in interior British Columbia, in a place where normally nobody needs air conditioners. So thus my casual attire. But I'll struggle through the heat and try to do some justice to the Canadian perspective on this debate. I'm going to talk a little bit about, and building on what Catrina and Michael have already said, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Canadian moves, interest in a border carbon adjustment, what it might look like from a Canadian perspective, how likely it is, and then move from the Canadian to the international and consider in closing the need for international cooperation on an instrument like this and what that international cooperation might look like. So to start, border carbon adjustment is, and I'm going to call it BC, I'm going to call it border carbon adjustment because I'm not talking from the European perspective. It's been repeatedly mentioned in Canada as something that the Canadian government wants to look into. In our fall economic statement last year, it was mentioned in that context. It was mentioned and had its own section in our Strengthened Climate Plan, the new climate plan. It was actually mentioned in the latest budget, the 2021 budget, at which time the government announced its intent to set up a collaborative consultative working group on the subject. Why the interest? The climate plan that I mentioned legislates a rising carbon price within Canada going up to Canadian $170 a ton by 2030. That's about $130 a ton US. That's a very, and current prices are at $50 a ton. That's a very ambitious carbon price. And understandably, for the reasons that are evident from the previous presentations, Canadian industry is concerned about the impacts on its competitiveness, both within Canada's domestic market and in third country markets. So the Canadian government really, as an adjunct to that kind of climate ambition, has to think about ways to prevent leakage, the movement of its industry and emissions offshore in response to its climate policies, and competitiveness impacts, which basically deindustrialize us instead of decarbonizing us. What might that border carbon adjustment look like in Canada? Canada does not, as much as I say we have a carbon price, we do not have really a tax regime. And the Supreme Court recently ruled that it was not a tax regime. It's a regulatory regime. It's an output-based pricing system that covers, well, there is a fuel tax, but the output-based pricing system covers the sectors of interest from a border carbon adjustments perspective. That is the energy-intensive, trade-exposed sectors, the upstream commodities to which Catrina and Michael have both referred. The WTO legality of a border carbon adjustment is it can either be a tax adjustment akin to a value-added tax, which is adjusted both on imports as they show up at your borders and refunded on export to goods that leave your borders, or it can be a regulatory regime, an internal regulatory regime, which also applies at the border, similar to a performance standard applying at the border. So the EU, for example, is contemplating a regulatory regime that is a mirror of its internal regime, whereby importers would buy EU allowances as if they were operating under the EU emissions trading system. Canada's regime would probably look something like that. Similar to the EU, For legal reasons, this means we would not have export coverage, but it's impossible really to predict what the rest of that regime looks like. Michael and I have worked on what the design elements, the key design elements of a border carbon adjustment look like. There's at least 8 or 9 of them of interest. All of them remain a black box at this point. We're just starting in our consultations on this stuff. I want to talk a little bit about the challenge that the movement toward border carbon adjustment in Canada presents us with respect to our largest trading partner and southern neighbor, the United States. US and Canada are each other's largest export markets. US is the destination for almost 3/4 of Canadians' merchandise exports, and it's the source of almost half of our merchandise imports. Clearly, with a relationship like that, and also under the aegis of the USMCA, we would rather coordinate any sort of border regime with the United States, especially in the light of the newly climate ambitious US administration. But the ambition in the US up to this point is expressed largely in terms of industrial policy. That is support for affected industries, incentives, government procurement, instruments which more or less spend their way to climate ambition and performance, as opposed to taxing industry and imposing carbon costs on them. And as much as I love the proposal from CLC, what we've done is, what we're currently looking at in Canada is a US that doesn't seem immediately disposed to implementing carbon taxing or carbon pricing of any kind. That puts us in a hard place, because recall that a border carbon adjustment is basically a mechanism to try to level the costs that we've imposed on our domestic producers and ensure that the foreign producers have felt those same costs. If it's true that US climate policy looks a lot like industrial policy, and if I'm going on an analysis that we undertook in a recent a paper about to be published on Canadian border carbon adjustment, it looks like the US industrial sectors in question, very few of them will suffer significant costs under the US regulatory regime, number one, so there's not much to adjust. And number two, we don't really have scope to adjust for regulatory costs at the border. It would be highly illegal under WTO rules, both on the import side and the export side. So for us, it's a conundrum. We don't know how to coordinate with the United States that doesn't have a border carbon adjustment. But given the timeline, $170 a ton out to 2030, we can't afford to wait for the US to put that instrument in place. So this presents us with a challenge which is not yet resolved, but will probably be resolved by the exigencies of the Canadian climate ambition. I want to end by talking about the need for international cooperation on border carbon adjustment. This is an instrument which, if constructed well, and I want to go back to the point that we've got something like 8 or 9 different design elements, each of which is like a branch in a decision tree. So you can have a border carbon adjustment that looks a myriad of different ways, depending on which way you go at each of those junctures. If it's designed well, if all the right routes are taken, that instrument can be a powerful complement to climate ambition, an enabler of climate ambition at a domestic level. If it is designed poorly, it can be an instrument of protection designed to punish trading partners, distort trade flows, and work to the benefit of domestic producers to the detriment of foreign producers on an unfair basis. There will always be pressures at the domestic level to formulate the instrument such that it looks a little more like the latter than the former. That's just the reality of lawmaking. The way we have found to get around that in the context of trade rules and the governance of trade flows is international multilateral agreement on best practice and principles, enshrined, for example, in the body of WTO law, enshrined, for example, in the USMCA. It's my contention then that we need the similar agreement at the international level on principles, best practices to guide border carbon adjustment, its implementation, its elaboration, because the European Union will not be the last jurisdiction that implements this kind of a tool. The UK is also looking into it. Canada is looking into it. The UK has enunciated its intent to put one in place. Any jurisdiction with high climate ambition has to be looking at ways to prevent leakage and competitiveness. And as imperfect an instrument as a border carbon adjustment is, as complex as it is, as legally questionable as it is, it may be the best we've got. So all of those countries covering 60% of global GDP that have expressed a desire to get to net zero by 2050, when they start putting those commitments into practice, the rubber hits the road, we're going to be looking at the possibility of more instruments like border carbon adjustment. When that happens, it would be nice to have international agreement on what best practice looks like, on the principles for elaboration. For example, as an example of best practice, any such instrument should give credit for forward pricing of carbon. Otherwise, you're you're penalizing unfairly those clean producers abroad. Any such instrument should not afford double protection to domestic industries. In the context of the European Union, this talks to getting rid of free allocation to the extent you introduce PCA. In the context of Canada, it talks to a similar ramping down of output-based allocation. A methodological best practice would be what default is used when the good shows up at your border in terms of GHG intensity. How do you calculate what that default is? Michael noted that the European Union, in its final phase, will talk about a default of 10% worst EU performers. It would be nice to have international agreement on what that might look like, and it probably wouldn't be that punitive. It would be nice to have international agreement on how the revenues should be used. Should they be kept? Should they be used to subsidize domestic decarbonization? Should they be sent abroad to help effective foreign producers? This kind of agreement, it strikes me, is fundamentally necessary if this tool is going to, in fact, be a tool for climate and environmental objectives as opposed to a protectionist tool. So to sum up, border carbon adjustment, being a product of climate ambition, is coming. And we're going to see it in more and more jurisdictions, perhaps accompanied by other things. It's not a silver bullet, but it certainly is a live candidate. It will probably come to Canada. We need, before that rush to the instrument happens, we need international agreement on what kinds of principles, best management practices should be followed in its elaboration and its implementation. To ensure that we're not dismantling the benefits of international trade for the sake of environmental protection. I'll stop there. Happy to get into further discussion. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Aaron. That's very thoughtful comments, and you tiptoed around the issue, which we may get to during the questions, about the common responsibility, common but differentiated responsibilities, and will be an interesting topic that we hopefully will get to have time for in the Q&A in terms of what happens to those revenues when they're collected. Our final speaker today is James Rorke, and is the Assistant Director of the Fiscal Affairs Department, the International Monetary Fund. He recently took on a new role, an exciting role, which is Climate Change Policy Coordinator, where he's overseeing a team at the IMF of dedicated experts to address fiscal policies that affect climate change. His previous IMF assignments are a long list of impressive ones, including Mission Chief for Russia and Serbia. We may get back to you on that one in just a moment, James. Policy response to the global financial crisis, development of policies for reserve adequacy and sovereign debt restructuring. He previously worked at the United Kingdom Treasury. We're very fortunate to have James with us today. James?
Okay, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. Let me try to share my screen. And
I should add that James is in Rome, so we've got him up late today, and we really particularly appreciate him dialing in.
Well, I really appreciate that you actually moved it a little earlier, so I can enjoy my dinner after this. But this is some work we've been doing in the fund, which is going to come out. I'm actually sort of previewing some stuff that's going to come out in a couple of papers, I think probably around the end of next week, which look at the issue of border carbon adjustments. I need to preface this by saying this is a staff view. This is preliminary stuff I'm showing you, and it's a staff view. This is not the decided view of the institution, nor are we trying to take positions on these issues. We were trying to shed light on the discussion for the benefit of all of our members. And I think I'm coming at this a little bit from the point of view of all members, including the countries that would be, if you like, subjected to a border adjustment, not necessarily only the ones who might be thinking about implementing it. And I want to pick up from where Aaron left it on international cooperation, because this, as you'd expect from the IMF, this is something we would really stress in this discussion. But I want to go even more ambitiously than Aaron, and say that the best solution would be to actually coordinate on the carbon pricing itself. And not to necessarily need then the border adjustment between countries, because if we did have all of these countries who are committing to net zero by mid-century actually taking the measures of carbon pricing, which we think is the most efficient way to get there, you would have much less of this issue of competition and leakage across countries in the first place, right? So you would need this whole debate, we would hope, would go away. Now, you may have that there's a group of, large group of countries that together want to have a border adjustment against non-participating countries. But, in terms of the sort of countries we've been talking about today, whether, it would be the US versus China, China, or Canada versus the US, if all of these countries were in an agreement on carbon pricing, you would avoid that. And that's why we've recently put out a proposal, in fact, for an international carbon price floor, which would be a complement to the Paris Agreement to galvanize ambition among a small group of large emitting countries. And just to mention on that the US, we understand the US carbon pricing is not about to happen. So you need that to be flexible and pragmatic to allow the US and other countries to use other solutions, other mitigation methods. We'd also, you were waiting to hear somebody say common but differentiated responsibilities. We think that would probably need to be reflected in different carbon prices across countries, and I think that's probably something that would be accepted among countries in that sort of proposal. So, but we are where we are, so this is why this slide says BCAs are the second best solution to coordination. Within that, we do think that coordination and the kind of cooperation and discussion, dialogue that Aaron was talking about would be necessary. So let me move on from this slide. Why are countries considering BCAs? I'm going to be very quick here. I think Catrina put this out very well. I mean, concerns about competitiveness, environmental concerns about leakage, and the idea that you may be able to encourage carbon pricing abroad. I think one thing I would say that we'd stress in our work that it's impossible to hit all your objectives with BCAs. It's very difficult to design something that's going to do everything. I mean, just to give an example, the sort of thing that the EU is talking about, this benchmarking on domestic emissions, it leaves very little incentive on foreign countries or firms to actually reduce their emissions. I think that actually may well make a lot of sense. I think, this is an objective that probably, one may have to give up on, but it's just an example of how hard it is to meet all of them. The other thing I think I wanted to point out here is just trying to pin down these effects on competitiveness, on leakage, are very difficult. The analytical work, the empirical work, finds it very hard to find these effects. And all the more so, I would say, where you're not using carbon pricing. This again, pick up what Aaron was saying, where firms are not, they're facing a shadow price perhaps for carbon, but they're not actually paying for emissions permits, or they're not paying a carbon tax. It's quite hard to identify an actual loss to the firms. And that becomes important also when you come to the legal issues. So here are just, very quickly on legal issues. Now, I'm not a lawyer. The lawyers, I have talked to lawyers in our institution, I've talked to lawyers in the WTO. I think all of them will stress that there is massive uncertainty about the legal situation here. A lot of people have views, but until these are tested at the WTO, I don't think anybody's really going to know what the final result is. There's a few things that you can look at, though. I mean, there's within the WTO rules. Aaron touched on this as well. I think there are certain things you can do within the rules. They probably most people I think would think they probably would allow charging based on embodied CO2. It's difficult because it's not like charging based on the amount of alcohol actually in a bottle of wine or a bottle of spirits. This is carbon which was used going into this thing. It's not in the piece of steel itself. But I think very often people are expecting that you'd need to go to environmental exceptions under Article 20 for the WTO. and this needs to be environmental grounds. You know, this cannot be something which is to support the competitiveness of your firm. You have to be making an environmental argument to meet that requirement. The other thing I want to point out here is on the climate policy side, on the Paris Agreement. Now, this has no legal, it's not a legally binding document, doesn't have legal bearing on this issue. But when it comes to the politics and the discussion about bringing people together on this, you know, there are some tensions in it. You know, Paris puts responsibility on the production in the country, not on consumption. Border adjustment tends to put this onto where goods are consumed rather than where they're produced. And again, this point of differentiated responsibility. Some people will argue that if you put a, say, advanced country carbon price onto imports from a developing country, you are, you know, not necessarily observing that principle. So that again is about making these proposals acceptable to have that global acceptance, because the Paris Agreement is already something that, you know, I wouldn't say fragile, but it involves cooperation, and we do not want to see the world turning into a retaliation and disagreement on policy to deal with emissions. Now, others have mentioned the design issues. I think this, you know, the design is in the details, is the catchphrase, if you like, of border adjustment. A few things here, coverage. I think most are focusing on these EITE, emissions intensive trade exposed industries. The one I want to focus on, particularly thinking about how this affects other countries, is the measurement. How do you assess the carbon in imports? Because it does make such a difference, you know, because of exactly as Catrina was pointing out, you know, many countries have, say, 3 or 4 times the emissions level. So if you were charging a tax 3 or 4 times as much as a domestic company is paying, that may be, you know, that is sort of tilting, going from one extreme of protecting competitiveness to actually making it very difficult for that foreign firm to compete. It may be very difficult for them to quickly, at least, adjust their emissions. Exports, we talked a bit about the rebates. I mean, this is interesting, you know, when we talk about border adjustment, historically, when we compare it with VAT, this always goes with export rebates. It's a no-brainer, right? So it's interesting that this is sort of being discussed differently here. You know, I would say that from a leakage point of view, I mean, I think there's just as much reason to expect leakage coming from the export side as the import side. So from that point of view, one might want to consider the rebates. And this the coordination issue. How do you allow for carbon pricing or mitigation policies elsewhere? You could either, you know, you could reduce the charges as you come in, or you could have a system. If you have export rebating, you could have a system like VAT where everybody rebates it on the way out and then it's charged again on the way into another country. The other thing I think that's important to think about is these BCAs are not coming out of nowhere. We have these free allowance systems. There's other proposals and other mechanisms around. I'm not going to go through this slide, but I think you need to think about the BCA in comparison with other proposals. And you are, you know, introducing something which has a lot of trade implications, international implications. So you've got to be sure it's worth it, if you like, compared to the other alternatives that you have. Economically, I think that's a case that's relatively easy to make, but much harder to make when you take the politics and all of this into account, perhaps. Now, what about the impact on trading partners? Here, I think one key element to think about is to think about carbon pricing and the border carbon adjustment together, right? If you just think about, you know, from the carbon border adjustment by itself, then obviously that seems like just putting a new tax on imports, right? But we're talking about this in the context of rising carbon prices. The reason this is coming along is carbon prices are rising. So it makes sense really to think about these together. And if you did the carbon pricing without the BCA or without other measures to offset the effects, you know, you would be giving a comparative advantage to your import, to your trading partners. So the question is, does the BCA correct that, and does it correct that in a reasonable way? Do together these come together without you know, necessarily favouring one or another? I think that's something that trading partners will be very naturally very interested in and looking at. But I think that's the way to look at it. I'm not going to go through the details of this slide as to how we think about that. That's in the papers we're putting out. But, you know, just this final point here on the revenues has come up a lot. one issue we do think about is that the BCA, in a way, it allows carbon pricing to feed through to domestic prices in a way that free allowances and exemptions and things don't. So the incidence of the carbon price, you would expect at least partly, possibly quite a lot to fall on domestic consumers. Also with revenues, of course, if you do have export rebates, the revenues need not necessarily be very, very large. For some countries, it could be negative. So that's another issue I think to consider. But I will stop there and thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Certainly, thank you very much to each of our speakers. This is a very exciting area, and appreciate each of you contributing what you've contributed. Thank you, James. Your comments in particular were really useful. Let me ask you all, we have time for a couple quick questions. We have a whole bunch coming through. I'll say to all those who don't get their questions asked, you have the contact details of each of the four speakers. Please feel free to reach out to them directly. I'm going to share one picture with you and get this down. So this is a quote from the Wall Street Journal on June 10. In Russia, which would be the economy most affected by the tax, they're talking about the EU CBAM carbon border adjustment mechanism that was the leaked version. Heavy industries have begun to spin off carbon-intensive production into separate companies. Aluminum giant Rusal said last month it would spin off its higher polluting smelters into a separate company that would sell largely to the domestic market. Rusal would rename itself AL Plus, smelters that are powered by low carbon hydropower in Siberia. So my question to the team, and particularly to those speaking to the EU market and possible CBAMs there, is the climate being helped by this, and or is free trade being helped by this? It looks like there'll be exactly as much carbon emitted as before. I welcome anybody's thoughts.
Aaron, you should go ahead.
Michael knows this is a pet topic of mine. So the academic term for this is resource shuffling, based on the experience of California in implementing a low carbon electricity standard and their difficulties with imported electricity coming from existing clean producers with really no change in final production patterns. And it would undermine the domestic ambition. It's not as black and white as it sounds. So if we are imagining a system which rewards domestic producers for clean production, is it actually a bad thing from an environmental perspective to reward foreign producers for a similar clean production? I would argue it's probably not. But from the perspective of protecting domestic industry and ensuring the effectiveness or political viability of the law, it may be an issue. It will be an issue to the extent that there is enough existing foreign production to, without any changing production pattern, fill the export streams that are currently going to the EU, if the EU is the only country adopting this. If we start to see, the more countries you see adopting this, the less that's likely to happen, because there isn't enough clean production to fill all of those orders. You will have to see changes in production patterns to make that work. And moreover, the widespread adoption of this kind of an instrument, or pricing in general on carbon, are going to lead to incentives to change production patterns. I'm not downplaying this as a significant risk, both politically and economically, but it's not as black and white as it might appear.
Can I quickly add a thought to that? I mean, Aaron and I have had some I would say, playfully controversial discussions about this, and all in all, though, I think I agree. I want to mention, though, that sort of singling out one specific issue. The European Commission, it's mentioned even in the leaked proposal. There is a provision about that, just like California was aware of the risk of resource shuffling and had some difficulty in trying to deal with it, but it's not like it's an unknown or surprising or sort of issue. I would also, though, mention that within the last 18 months, we have seen very high level statements from Turkey, from Ukraine, from Russia, and from other countries that know they will be heavily affected if this comes into force, saying, okay, we're going to accelerate our efforts to implement carbon pricing, to move forward with many plans that have been sort of lingering and slowly moving forward. There's a lot of movement there. And I think that's an aspect to your question, Stephen, is this good for the climate or not? For better or for worse, this has kickstarted some debates that had not been moving forward for a long time.
Thank you. I know we're at our hour mark. Let's see if they'll let me sneak in a couple more questions here. A number of questions about the political dynamic and how likely it is that that any of this will come to pass in any of these countries. Assuming we don't have a club, because if a club is probably an actual solution, Glasgow, where a bunch of the country, EU and others agree on a set of carbon policies. Let's not get something that universal. What are these questions? What are the odds? What's the likelihood we'll get any meaningful advanced in isolation of other countries? Is that even ultimately something that will come its own weight, or isn't it? All right, James, how about you?
Oh, okay. Well, I thought this was a question for Michael, actually, as the EU expert, because that seems, that seems to be the most likely place that it's going to happen. I mean, I think it is. I think it is. I think the EU is serious, and I think that one of the question that seems to be coming up a lot now is this issue about comparing to other methods, and the the producers, not just in Europe, but I think everywhere, they like the free allowances. The free allowances is actually a bit of a gift to a lot of producers, and so politically, it may be difficult to wean them off that. And I think the economic logic is, of course, that you would replace the free allowances with, if you introduce a BCA. But it is difficult to understand exactly how you're going to deal with exports in an emissions trading system. And to me, again, I'd be interested in what Michael says about this, but to me that may be quite a difficult stumbling block.
Should I follow up on that,
Sure.
Stephen?
Yeah, please.
Aaron, I didn't spell it out. I really just implied that it's going to be a hot issue. And indeed, the leak proposal does not have any safeguard for exports. There's a good reason for that. James, Aaron both alluded to that. Unlike Catrina's purely price-based approach, I mean, the proposal of CLC, where the agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures has a footnote, a nice, well spelled out footnote, that indirect taxes, can be offset rebated at the border, as long as it doesn't exceed sort of what the domestic producers face. With regulatory measures, there is no such clarification, no such exceptions. There's great concern that rebating, say, an emissions trading system such as the EU has, or such as some Canadian provinces have at the border, would violate this treaty, being considered a prohibited subsidy, and open the door for retaliation and other things. And so that's really a rock in a hard place to me, as I see it. And I think, Aaron and others, we've discussed this as well. For the EU, they know that without the safeguard for exports, there's a huge open flank, but it's legally, it seems very risky to do something about that. And so this approach of maybe still keeping some free allocation, substituting it over time with the CBAM, that might be a way to kind of at least buy time. And this would also apply to exports, but it's not going to go away as a.
Catrina, in the absence of a carbon dividend plan or just a price on carbon, is there any meaningful avenue forward for a BCA in the United States?
It's a really great question, and how the border carbon adjustment literature has evolved has been responsive to one instrument and one instrument only, and that's a price on carbon that you can measure in dollars and cents. That's a limitation. we know that there are a lot of good reasons to apply a border carbon adjustment for climate ambition, for economic competitiveness, to stave off leakage, to build political coalitions in favor of domestic action. And the literature is sort of limiting us in looking at this border adjustment mechanism only if we apply something that looks like a carbon price in the form of a carbon fee or a cap and trade system. So, we're waiting on smarter people than us to give us some guidance on if we can color outside the lines. It seems like there may be opportunity, but nobody's put in the work to define what those instruments could look like in this alternative scenario.
Can I just mention one possible alternative? Because I think Catrina is right. You're not going to see a border carbon adjustment in absence of some kind of carbon price. But if we're casting around for alternatives, you look at the leaders' communique from the G7 meeting in June, which talked about establishing a industrial decarbonization agenda with specific reference to the kinds of sectors we're looking at here. And reading between the lines, I think what the point is a agreement on low carbon performance standards for some of these energy intensive trade exposed sectors. So if you're asking me how could, for example, Canada and the US collaborate in a way that prevents leakage and competitiveness impacts, one way might be a collaborated staged schedule of ratcheting up of standards, low carbon standards for goods like steel, cement, nitrate fertilizers, which are applied at the border. So it's a mandatory standard. That's the kind of thing that, if you're casting around for something that you could use in the absence of a carbon price, that's one viable alternative.
We're going to need to call it a day there. We're over our 1 hour, and we try to be pretty disciplined about that. Obviously, these topics we could spend a ton of time on. Our thought at the Center for Energy Studies, the Baker Institute, is that we'd probably do a follow-up session to this in probably the early autumn, September, October. Invite some of our speakers back, add some others as well, do a little bit more of an in-dive. We're expecting, as you've heard, to receive in mid-July all of us the EU proposal on CBAM's non-leaked version, and as well as James mentioned, white paper from the IMF as well. So we'll have much more to talk about. Please feel free to reach out directly to any of our speakers. All of their links are in the invitation and on the CES website. Their papers, if they give us permission, will be posted up there as well, their slides. Thank you all very much. Thank you to the audience. Lovely group today. And thank you as well, particularly to our speakers. Appreciate it. Have a good day.
Thank you. You too.
Thanks. Cheers.
Thank you.